The cabin had always been my quiet place, the kind of silence you can hear in your own chest. Pines wrapped around the valley like a wall, the lake below glassy and still, morning fog lifting slow as if the land itself was waking up. I was splitting wood when the SUV rolled up the dirt road, tires crunching loud enough to break the peace. Glossy black. HOA decals on the door. That alone told me this wasn't going to be a friendly visit. She stepped out wearing sunglasses too big for her face, clipboard hugged to her chest like a weapon. The confidence came first, words later. She didn't introduce herself, didn't ask my name, just looked at the cabin like it offended her personally. "This structure is not approved," she said, already scribbling. "You'll need to vacate." I almost laughed. Almost. I asked her which HOA she represented. She smirked like the answer should have been obvious. "The Lakeview Valley Association. This entire area falls under our jurisdiction." That's when I knew exactly how this was going to go. I told her calmly that this land wasn't part of any HOA, that the cabin was legally built, permitted, and older than half the homes down by the lake. She didn't look up from her clipboard, just checked a box and said she'd be issuing fines retroactively for unauthorized construction and unregistered occupancy. Retroactively. Asked her to leave. She adjusted her sunglasses and told me she'd already taken photos. Said enforcement would handle it. Then she turned around, climbed back into her SUV, and drove off like she'd just conquered something. An hour later, my phone buzzed. A neighbor from Down Valley texted, "Dude, HOA is saying you're squatting. They're calling the cops." That got my attention. I wasn't angry yet. More curious. Because for someone so sure, she hadn't asked for a single document. Not a deed. Not a map. Not a boundary survey. Just assumed authority because she wore the badge and carried the clipboard. By the time the sheriff's truck showed up, the sun was higher, burning off the fog. 2 deputies stepped out, polite but cautious. They said they'd received a complaint about illegal occupancy and zoning violations. I invited them in, offered water, and told them they were welcome to look around. That's when the HOA SUV came back. She marched up like this was her stage. Immediately started talking over everyone, how I'd been warned, how I was trespassing, how the HOA had every right to enforce removal. One deputy asked her for documentation proving the cabin fell under HOA control. She froze for half a second, then handed him a generic HOA map, color-coded, blurry, and clearly not to scale. The deputy frowned. I went inside and brought out a folder. Thick. Old. The kind of paperwork that smells like time. Deeds, surveys, county records. I laid them out on the hood of the sheriff's truck. The oldest document was over 100 years old. The valley wasn't just mine. It had always been. The deputies started reading. The HOA Karen stopped talking. The confidence drained from her posture as fast as it had arrived. Lines she'd rehearsed clearly weren't working anymore. One deputy looked up and asked her a simple question. "Ma'am, do you know where your HOA boundaries actually end?" She didn't answer. She couldn't, because in that moment, standing beside my cabin with the entire valley stretching out behind us, the truth was finally catching up to her. And this was only the beginning. The air changed once the deputies finished reading. You could feel it the moment authority quietly switched sides. The younger deputy folded the map the HOA Karen had handed over and set it aside, like it no longer mattered. The older one tapped my documents with his finger, slow and deliberate, then looked out over the valley, as if seeing it properly for the first time. "So you're saying," he said, turning to her, "that your HOA map ignores these recorded boundaries?" She opened her mouth, closed it, then tried again. "Our association has governed the lake area for decades. Everyone knows that. This cabin," she pointed again, her fingers shaking now, "was never approved." I didn't raise my voice. I didn't interrupt. I just slid one more paper forward. A county-certified survey, stamped and signed, clearly marking the HOA boundary line stopping nearly a mile short of my cabin. The deputy nodded slowly. "This land isn't just outside your HOA," he said. "It's not even close." That's when the tone shifted. The Karen stopped speaking to the deputies and started speaking at them, talking about community standards, visual pollution, and how my cabin lowered property values. She claimed residents had complained, claimed I was hostile, claimed I'd refused compliance. The deputy asked her if she'd verified ownership before issuing fines. She said she didn't need to. Bad answer. The older deputy explained, calmly, firmly, that filing false complaints and attempting to enforce authority outside HOA jurisdiction could qualify as harassment. Her face went pale. Not angry pale. Oh no, pale. Then came the line that really broke her. You also called this in as a possible squatting situation, the deputy said. Which means you accuse this man of occupying land illegally. She tried to backpedal, fast. Said it was procedural language. Said enforcement required it. Said it was all standard. The deputy shook his head. Ma'am, procedures don't override facts. I finally spoke. I told her this cabin wasn't new. That my family had built it generations ago. That the valley wasn't divided into lots because it was never meant to be. That I paid county taxes on every acre she was standing on, including the road she'd driven in on. That's when realization hit her like a wall. She turned slowly, scanning the trees, the slopes, the distant ridgeline. You could see the mental math failing in real time. The valley was bigger than she'd imagined. Much bigger. The deputy asked her if the HOA had ever conducted a professional boundary survey. She said no. Asked if they'd verified deeds before collecting dues from properties near the edge. She said she assumed the developer handled that. The word assumed echoed louder than anything else that day. The deputies stepped aside to talk privately. When they came back, their decision was clear. No violations. No fines. No enforcement. Instead, they advised her strongly to stop contacting me and to correct any HOA records that suggested authority over my land. She didn't argue anymore. She packed up her clipboard like it suddenly weighed 100 pounds. Before getting into her SUV, she tried one last thing, said maybe we could work something out and discuss voluntary compliance for community harmony. I smiled and told her she was trespassing. That did it. She left without another word. But the story didn't end there. Because 2 days later, I got a letter in the mail. Official HOA letterhead. No apology. No correction. Just a notice of an emergency board meeting to discuss encroachment concerns. They still thought they had a move left. What they didn't know, what they couldn't know, was that the valley didn't just belong to me on paper. The emergency board meeting wasn't an invitation. It was a declaration. They posted notices at the lake, emailed residents, and even taped one to a tree near my road, as if paper could claim what deeds already settled. I decided to attend, not to argue, but to listen. When you understand how people think, you learn how they'll fail. The meeting room buzzed with outrage before I even sat down. Folding chairs scraped. Voices overlapped. A projector glowed with a map that still swallowed my valley into their tidy blue outline. The Karen stood at the front, flanked by board members who nodded along like dashboard ornaments. She spotted me and stiffened, then pressed on. She framed me as a problem, an uncooperative land user, a visual nonconformity. She spoke about safety, access, and emergency response, as if those words could replace jurisdiction. Every sentence assumed authority that didn't exist. When a resident asked whether the sheriff had sided with them, she dodged and said the matter was under review. That's when I raised my hand. The room went quiet in that brittle way quiet does when it's forced. I introduced myself, thanked the board for the floor, and asked one question. Which parcel numbers did the HOA believe they governed beyond the lakefront lots? They tried to answer with the map again. Asked for parcel numbers. Silence. I pulled out copies of county records and handed them down the row. Deeds, plats, tax receipts, conservation easements. I explained that the road they claimed as community access crossed my land under a revocable license granted decades ago, never an easement. I explained that the water intake feeding their manicured shoreline rested on land I owned outright. I explained that their map was an approximation built from assumptions stacked on assumptions. A murmur spread. Someone whispered, "Is that true?" The Karen interrupted, saying ownership didn't matter because the HOA provided services. I asked which services extended to my land. She said oversight. The word landed wrong, and she knew it. Oversight isn't a service, it's a claim. I told them I had no intention of joining the HOA, but I did intend to protect my property. Calmly, I announced that the revocable road license would be reviewed, and until then, commercial enforcement vehicles were prohibited from entering my land. I added that any further false reports to law enforcement would be documented and escalated. That's when the board's attorney stood up. He asked for a recess. When they returned, the tone had changed again. Softer. Careful. The attorney acknowledged discrepancies and proposed forming a boundary clarification committee. I agreed on one condition: an independent surveyor chosen by the county. No internal maps. No shortcuts. They accepted. After the meeting, residents approached me quietly. Some apologized. Some asked questions. A few thanked me. The Karen avoided eye contact and left early, phone pressed tight to her ear. A week later, the survey stakes went in. Bright flags tracing lines the HOA had never wanted to see. The results were worse for them than even I'd expected. Not only was my cabin outside their reach, but key infrastructure they relied on wasn't theirs at all. They underestimated patience, mistook silence for weakness, and believed momentum could replace law, history, and boundaries without ever checking the records. The board panicked. Emails flew. Lawyers talked. And in their scramble, they made a decision that crossed a line, one that turned a paperwork dispute into something much more serious. They didn't wait for the survey report. That should have told everyone exactly how desperate the board had become. 3 days after the stakes went in, I woke to the sound of engines on the road below, heavy ones. Through the trees, I saw 2 contracted enforcement trucks and a utility crew idling where my license clearly prohibited them. The HOA had decided to act first and explain later. I walked down with my phone recording. The Karen stood there again, flanked by workers who looked uncomfortable. She announced they were securing community assets and ordered the crew to install a gate across the access road. I asked to see the authorization. She waved a board resolution. I asked whether the county had approved construction on private land. She ignored me and told the crew to proceed. That's when I made the call. The sheriff arrived fast, same older deputy, same calm presence. He listened, reviewed the license, the survey stakes, and the notices I'd sent the board after the meeting. He asked the Karen a single question: "Who told you this was allowed?" She said the board voted. He nodded. "Boards can vote for a lot of things," he said. "Doesn't make them legal." Work stopped. The crew backed off. The deputy explained that continuing would constitute trespass and interference with a lawful property right. He advised them to leave immediately. The Karen protested, louder now, saying the HOA had invested money and residents demanded action. The deputy warned her once. She kept talking. That's when he issued the citation. Watching her confidence finally crack was almost uncomfortable. She argued the ticket, accused me of manipulation, accused the deputy of bias. He remained unmoved. When the trucks rolled out, she stayed behind, staring at the stakes like they'd betrayed her personally. The fallout was swift. That evening, residents received a notice claiming temporary suspension of access due to unforeseen boundary complications. My phone rang nonstop, homeowners worried about deliveries, emergency access, and property values. I told them the truth. The HOA had overreached, again, and consequences followed. The board tried to spin it. They blamed contractors. They blamed outdated maps. They blamed miscommunication. What they couldn't blame was the surveyor's final report when it landed 2 days later, stamped and definitive. The valley lines were clear. Their authority ended where my land began, and not 1 inch further. Their attorneys sent a letter asking to negotiate. I replied with terms: formal correction of HOA maps, written retractions of all complaints to law enforcement, reimbursement of legal and survey costs, and a recorded acknowledgement of my ownership. No more assumptions. No more shortcuts. They balked. So I escalated. I filed notice to revoke the road license entirely, effective in 30 days, unless terms were met. I notified the county about the unauthorized construction attempt. I sent copies to the sheriff and the board's insurer. Suddenly, the HOA wasn't talking about enforcement anymore. They were talking about exposure. Residents turned on the board. Meetings got heated. Resignations followed. The Karen stopped showing up. When the board finally accepted my terms, it wasn't with speeches or bravado, just signatures, quiet and rushed. The documents were recorded the next morning. By the end of the week, new maps replaced the old ones. My land disappeared from their jurisdiction like it had never been there at all, which, legally, it never had. The quiet returned slowly, like the valley was exhaling after holding its breath. The new HOA maps went up, neat and corrected, my land cleanly erased from their blue borders. The road signs changed. The email stopped. For the first time since the SUV had first rattled up the dirt road, there was no clipboard, no threats, no assumptions riding in on borrowed authority. But peace doesn't erase accountability. The county's review moved forward without noise or drama, which is how serious things usually happen. The unauthorized construction attempt was logged. The false complaints were noted. The attempted enforcement outside jurisdiction became part of a record the HOA's insurer couldn't ignore. Premiums went up. Coverage narrowed. And the board, what remained of it, was forced into compliance training they never thought they'd need. The Karen resigned quietly. No farewell email. No explanation. One day she was there, the next she wasn't. Rumors said she'd moved. Others said she'd been removed. I didn't care which was true. Authority, without verification, has a way of ending the same way every time. Residents adapted. Some took the long way around. Others petitioned the county for proper easements and learned, the hard way, how expensive assumptions can be. A few came to me directly, apologized, and asked about access agreements done the right way. We talked. We documented. We did things cleanly. The sheriff stopped by once more, not for a complaint, but for coffee. He said he wished more disputes ended with records instead of raised voices. He asked how long my family had owned the valley. I told him the truth, that we'd never owned it in the way people usually mean. We'd just taken responsibility for it longer than most. When the season turned, the fog lifted earlier. Sunlight found the lake again. The cabin stood where it always had, unchanged, unbothered, and undeniably mine. The valley didn't need an HOA to exist. It never had. And the lesson traveled farther than the lakefront ever could. Power doesn't come from titles or clipboards or maps drawn to convenience. It comes from knowing the land, respecting boundaries, and checking the records before you knock on someone else's door. Somewhere down valley, the HOA continued on, smaller, quieter, corrected. They learned what happens when authority outruns reality. Up here, the only thing that enforced anything was the wind through the trees and the truth written in ink a century old. And that was more than enough.